welcome to all of you, and particularly to Sri Damodaran, who has been a guiding light and truly deep thinker on India's corporate governance landscape. It is fitting that he has lent his leadership to yet another industry initiative aimed at raising the governance bar for Indian entities. I'm delighted that FICCI and Global Risk Management Institute have partnered to develop this carefully drafted framework on risk management. The Model Risk Code being released today is a practical guidance on risk management. I have often held that evaluating and addressing risk is a critical attention area for boards. Yet it is perhaps the least understood in its true sense by most boards. Therefore, any framework that helps businesses take more informed and risk-intelligent decisions should be most welcome. The last few years have taught businesses the importance of addressing and mitigating risks and uncertainties that are unforeseeable, yet capable of destabilizing even the most well-thought-out business models. As a regulator and governance monitor, SEBI mandates risk management committees for listed top 1,000 market cap companies. But for lasting effectiveness, this sensitization and skill needs to percolate downwards as well. In this context, the Model Risk Code addresses entities of all sizes, including non-listed and private entities and other bodies. Thus, it can be of great significance in building risk maturity in all manner of enterprises, should they choose to draw upon the code. Business risks are now clearly beyond physical or financial. Strategic, operational, geopolitical, reputational, compliance, and business continuity risks are all relevant and require diligent monitoring and mitigation. This code offers support to boards as accountability increases each passing day. The task force led by Mr. Damodaran has put in many hours of deliberation and iterations to bring out a comprehensive and contemporary document. On behalf of FICCI, I express my gratitude to the chairman and all members of the task force, some of whom are very dear friends. The code being released also has contribution from many practitioners. We urge our members to benefit from cutting-edge insights that the code offers, and based on users' feedback, FICCI would be happy to review and integrate more best practices into the code. Thank you.
Firstly, a very warm welcome to all of you. Thank you for making time. I know our levels of passion around this are possibly evident in terms of what you will see happen over the next couple of hours. Without taking any time, let me take this opportunity to invite the board chairman of GRMI, Mr. Subodh Bhargava. Some of you know him as also the former president of CII. He's been the chairman at Tata Communications, GSK. He's also been the group chairman at the Aisha Group. But most importantly, I guess, has been a big mentor for me personally and for the Institute. Welcome, Mr. Bhargava.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's indeed a privilege to welcome each one of you to this code launch event. A very special welcome to Mr. Damodaran, Mr. Birla, members of the task force and panelists today. I've been associated with Global Risk Management Institute for a few years now. And during this period, I have often wondered, why has Subhashish taken this initiative? What value will he deliver to corporate India? And why the need for risk? I belong to the era of supply-side economy, where the only risk was not knowing the right person at the Udyog Bhavan. And perhaps the second real risk was breakdown in your supply chain. Because everything was licensed, you couldn't produce one piece extra. So supply chain did cause some problem, and therefore there was some exposure to risk to us also pre-91. But I think what happened in 91, you all know the story. For the first time, there was the risk vis-a-vis competition. You had to understand competition strategies. Corporate India, the CEOs, the owners, the professionals, for the first time, started understanding what is a strategy beyond the government of India. The strategy risk was not understood, quite frankly, to my mind in the beginning. I think we were going all over, whether it is acquiring, downsizing, upsizing, taking risks without understanding what are the risk elements which needed to be evaluated with respect to strategy. And what really led was perhaps the corporate India and the managers thought, let me make some rules and regulations and the risks will be eliminated. Now that was all right for internal risk, but when it came to strategic risk or external risk which was already there, I don't think we were quite conscious and quite aware of. And this is where I think Global Risk Management Institute brings out its relevance at the time and for the content both. The timing was ripe because corporate India has matured over the last, since 91, for 2 decades at least. And corporate India was ready to welcome new, innovative management practices. Global Risk Management Institute, GRMI's objective is to really make corporate India resilient, agile, future ready for looking at institution, the enterprise, with that perspective. The second thing, of course, which was corollary to that was that who was to manage risk? And that is where I think GRMI has initiated its contribution to the corporate India by having today nearly 200 risk managers trained who are now actually in the field working. And this journey for growing the number of risk professionals who can add value to corporate India is going to continue, hopefully with the support of corporate India. Let me just mention about the code. Why the code? If we are training people and they are going into corporate world, I think this code is going to be sort of a toolkit to bring about in the minds of the, or in the system of the corporate boards, senior officials, the risk assessment and risk mitigation processes as a part of their DNA. And I think this is where we are moving ahead, hopefully. The corporate India is looking at this. One small concern which, in fact, I shared with Subhashish, how do we bring in this risk concept of managing, identifying, mitigating to other than large enterprises, the MSMEs? I mean, I'm not talking about entire range, but there are a lot of medium-sized companies who are exposed to risk, and they are the backbone of Indian economy. And unless they are also able to mitigate and get focused on risk management, I don't think the large enterprises will succeed in the long run. And this reminds me of early 90s when India looked at learning quality. For the first time, Indian industry talked about quality, whether it was product or services. We learned, the large enterprises learned from all over the world. We brought experts from Japan, US, elsewhere, to teach us quality. And then the OEMs, the large enterprises, took the message of quality to their supply chain, the medium and small industry. To my mind, it was one of the finest work done by the large enterprises in their own self-interest, because the amount of outsourcing in most of the industry domains is such that unless the supply chain was equally focused on quality and complying to quality, the end product could not have been. And I think this is the journey which perhaps for the risk management could also be adopted. I would like to conclude by thanking first FICCI for the partnerships they've had with GRMI, and most sincere thanks to Mr. Damodaran and the members of the task force for their tiring work, as Siddharth said, that they had many hours going on to it, and I do hope that this code, as launched now, would be a great asset to corporate India to adopt and implement. Thank you, and once again, very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bhargava. At this stage, if I could request Parikshit to come up, and we are fortunate that Mr. Damodaran's agreed to do a fireside chat where Parikshit gets to fire his round of questions at Mr. Damodaran.
Who better to discuss all of this with than Mr. M. Damodaran, former SEBI chairman, also chairman of Excellence Enablers, and someone who's headed this task force as well. Sir, thank you very much for talking to us. And let me begin by asking you, do you think the value of risk management in companies is greater today than ever before?
It was always great. The problem was that most people didn't understand its importance. Let me get back to 2013 and the Companies Act, and this has been, for me personally, a very big disappointment, that the Companies Act mandated 4 committees of the board. I wish it had also mandated the Risk Management Committee. It left it too late. SEBI had to come in and then mandate the Risk Management Committee. The problem with that is that while the others are board committees, this is a board appointed committee with some persons from the board and some persons from outside the board. Has risk got enough importance in the process? Sadly, no. At the same time, corporates have believed that without a logical, scientific approach to risk management, you can survive. You may on occasion prosper also. But they don't realize that when bad times come, you need to have some structural support to fall back on. And to your question, is it being perceived as more important now? Perhaps the awareness is more, but it was always important.
Going through this report, I came across some key words: treat, tolerate, transfer, terminate. You've gone on to say, and your team has gone on to say, that risk management should be in the day-to-day DNA of the company. How should we inculcate that, and what direction would you like to give to the industry?
I think there must be more conversation around this. If you look at board meetings 5 years ago, I'm not even going back to 10 years ago, there was no conversation about risk in most boardrooms. There were some, but they were outliers, right? Who discussed risk, who discussed risk mitigation, discussed a policy around it, discussed who would mitigate risk, what kind of risks would be mitigated, have heat maps for risk. For the larger number of companies, all of this came much later. Today you hear conversation in the boardroom on this. It's from that level that the entire understanding of risk, appreciation of risk, the need to work on risk management, risk mitigation is actually percolating down. That message has to come from the top. It's happening. It's happening. Are we all satisfied? No, but this is always work in progress. There will still be some laggards that will need to catch up, and as Mr. Subodh Bhargav said, this is not just for the big companies. Even the small guys have to realize that risk is staring them in the face. It's a different matter if they close their eyes and pretend it doesn't exist, as some companies have done over the years.
Over the last 2 years of the pandemic, we had seen a boom in tech startups. They hired in big numbers. They got big investments as well. but for many of them, their products did not work once the pandemic started to recede. We started seeing the cases go down. Do you think this is an example of where we need risk management and daily analysis of the risks for the products that we are working on?
Let's park risk for a minute. If you spoke to people who were actually the driving forces of those startups and told them that you needed to put in place governance practices, they'll tell you, let's grow the business, we'll talk about governance later. And then something explodes before then. It's too late to pick up the pieces, and at that time, that's no time to, put in place governance policies. Now, when you're talking about risk, if they don't realize from day one that this is something that needs to be addressed, they will come to grief, and we've seen several of them. Not just those that promoted the startups, but those that invested in the startups have also come to grief because they thought this will work out. The model is so compelling. India is a large market. Anything that you produce by way of goods or services, there will be takers for it. Mr. Bhargav referred to quality, the quality consciousness. I don't know whether that has informed persons at different levels in the startups. So for them, risk is very important. We need to look at what can possibly go wrong. How do you anticipate it to the extent possible? What are the mitigation measures you need to put in place? All of this ought to be very, very actively considered by the promoters, by those that work with them, by the investors. Even the investors, the big boys that have come in and poured money, have not looked at this.
Very significantly, in your report, you have spoken about the fact that SEBI mandates that the top 1,000 companies, listed companies, need to have risk management committees. For others, you said that this can be a voluntary exercise, but there needs to be a greater appreciation. If we go to small and medium-sized companies, if you speak about MSMEs and startups, will a voluntary approach work? Or do you feel that this is also necessary, that somewhere this needs to be drafted into law?
I'm not a great believer in something being drafted into law and therefore impacting corporate conduct. If they don't see value in it, it might end up as one more tick box exercise. You can have laws, you can have regulation, right? All of that will in some manner get complied with. Will that be a manner which adds to the corporate's health and well-being? I'm not so sure. So don't mandate, because mandating something comes with a cost. If it is driven by understanding why it's important for them, you will get two things. One, practices that are consistent with a good risk management policy. Second, a shared ownership across the organization. The minute you mandate it, there will be some compliance officer who is dealing with it. Maybe the CEO deals with it. Mandating doesn't help.
Right. When you speak about PE, VC investors, do you also feel that we're now reaching a time when investors will seek Sorry. So, when we were talking about private equity, venture capitalists, do you feel that we've reached a time when investors will start seeking risk diligence reports before they invest in a particular entity? Are we reaching that time?
I'm surprised they haven't done it so far, considering the size of the investments and what's gone wrong. I mean, if you ask me when they should get started on it, the day before yesterday is a good starting point. But if they leave it too late, I'm afraid the game is lost for them. Because you are actually making big ticket investments. You go through all other kinds of diligence and you don't look at risk. That is the big boy that is going to impact. And we've seen, I don't want to take names, but just look at the startups which had great valuations and where they are today. Just look at that. And what went wrong? The fact that there was no provision for understanding risk and providing risk.
So clearly going forward, even though we believe that there are going to be greater investments coming into Indian startups in the year 2023, the focus on risk will be much greater. Let me also ask you about how do you think India is progressing when it comes to enabling ease of investing and encouraging global PE and venture capitalists?
Is that a question out of the syllabus as far as this is concerned? I know where this is coming from. Okay, let me put you at ease. I am chairing a committee which is looking at the regulatory environment to make life a little easier for PEs and PCs. The committee is hopefully in the last legs of its deliberations, and we should, in maybe the first 10 days of December, put together a report. More than that, I can't tell you anything at this stage.
Right. My final question, sir, just to sum up, we are very close to the budget. The budget consultations are well and truly on. How do you think the government should approach risk management, and what can this report actually give to the government, and how can you guide the government on risk management when it comes to policy making?
My reply might disappoint you. I am a little old-fashioned. I believe all that the budget, what is the budget? The budget is a financial statement which indicates income and expenditure for the next 12 months, right? But unfortunately, over the years, you've had all kinds of things loaded onto the budget speech which have no budgetary implications. Maybe it's a good opportunity for the government to make a statement regarding the direction of policy. Does that belong to the budget? I'm not so sure. What is it that the budget will say about this? Except to say that, you know, risk management is important, you need to do it. As I said, I'm not in favor of any law or regulation to drive this. Must be driven by an understanding of what is good for the corporate. If that doesn't happen, on a sustainable basis, it won't take off.
Right. And if I were to ask you, what would be the success in terms of the risk code and what it's trying to do for the industry, what it's trying to change in the industry, what would be successful according to you? What would be the benchmark for success of this risk code?
Let me tell you how this document came into being. Subhashish and his team have interacted with a large number of stakeholders in the corporate universe. I've had the privilege of working with exceptional persons on this task force. My only regret is we could not have in-person meetings because COVID got in the way, and therefore we were in front of screens connecting with one another. Hopefully it has not diminished the quality of what has gone into the report. How would you define success for this? Success will be when many people look at this not as a direction, not as something that is mandated, but as containing a whole lot of stuff which is the distilled wisdom of persons in corporate India, and see how to apply that to their own corporates. If that happens and more and more companies on their own understand risk and practice risk mitigation, I think all of us in the committee and Subhashish and his team who have worked 25/8, I think, during the last several months, they will clearly be rewarded.
All right, Mr. Damodaran, thank you very much for joining us, giving us your view on this model risk code. Very important for the industry, and it couldn't have come at a more important time and opportune time as well. Thanks once again.
Thank you.
Okay, so guess we are at that point or that moment that we've all been sort of waiting for the last 17 months from when this was a journey that started. I think in my mind, it started a year before that. I'll come to that. But I think we are at that moment when we're ready to release the model risk code formally. And what better way to do that than invite up on stage a bunch of well-wishers, guides, mentors, and friends. So if I may first request Mr. Subodh Bhargava to please come up. If I may request the cricketer on the ground from Anderson, Mukesh. That's how I remember Mukesh. Very different from his professional introduction, which we'll get to. So thank you again, everyone, for the release, and thank you so much, Mr. Damodaran, for your session and your insights on your views of the model risk code. Mr. Bhargava, for your address. I guess a little bit on the vision and the journey of the risk code itself. You know, Milton Friedman, about 50 years back, had made the famous comment that responsibility of businesses was to generate profits. Come 22 years later, the 2022 Edelman Trust Barometer actually said a very different thing. It said 81% of the 36,000 respondents across 25 plus countries believed that chief executives should have a point of view around social and political matters, and they should be part of the solution and not just the problem. Clearly, a significantly increased expectation from the corporate world, which in this room is represented by a bunch of you India Inc. leaders. And that exactly is what therefore requires corporate India to be a lot more resilient, agile, and as I would call it, future-proofed. The model risk code has as its vision that very intent, which is to be a playbook, a guide, a toolkit, whatever you want to call it, to ensure that boards and CEOs have an effective enabler to embed risk into their DNA. That's really what the code's intended to achieve. Many have asked me this question as to what triggered this off. Like Mr. Bhargava said, what triggered off the institute, what triggered off the code? While the journey started 17 months back, we had intended to release this before December, and we're thankful that we managed to do it. But this idea kind of crystallized in my mind about a year before that, on the back of a conversation I had with a CFO of a reasonably large global organization. So his problem statement was he was struggling to implement robust processes and monitor them. Now, having been an auditor in his previous avatar, he very quickly equated robust processes to good controls and good risk management. As I went through the discussion, and I tried to unpeel the onion a little bit more, I realized here were the characteristics of the organization. You had an organization where the head of assurance and controls, as they called her in that organization, rolled up to the CFO. Second characteristic, the head of assurance and controls and her team was also expected to have the ability to double hand and become the risk function of the organization. Here was a CFO who for the longest time had struggled to convince his CEO and business leaders that there was any value for risk management and controls because, quote unquote, whatever had to go wrong continues to go wrong. And the fourth characteristic was this was completely discretionary and therefore could happen when they had the time and when they had the money. It kind of made it very, very clear in my mind that those were essentially the what not to do's if you wanted to embed risk management in your DNA. So the code therefore really is an attempt to kind of break the 6 myths, as I've called it. No good reason why it's not the traditional 5 or an auspicious 7, it just happens to be 6 myths. But before I get to that, there's also one which is, what is it not? And I think Mr. Damodaran exactly said that. What it is not intended to do, having been a consulting professional till about 8 weeks back, generate another multi-billion-dollar consulting industry like SOX did. That's not the intent. The intent is for corporates to embrace this, see the real value they get out of it, appreciate what value preservation means, and how value creation happens. So coming to the 6 myths. The first one, internal audit can multitask and take on the role of internal auditors. Absolutely flawed, for the fundamental reason that internal audit is a third line of defense, to get a little technical, and it's a more of a assurance and monitoring function, whereas risk management fundamentally needs to be owned and delivered by the first and second line of defense, which is the real management. So to assume that one can play the role of the other is clearly flawed. What was reasonably mortifying through the industry consultation phase, to be honest, and I have to be really candid because I guess if you're trying to bring about change, you've got to have it in you to be candid about it, was multiple emails that went seeking feedback, promptly got forwarded to the head of audit saying, we are very keen on participating in this process. I've copied the head of audit. Who's the best equipped person to talk about this? Unfortunately, that's precisely what needs to stop, because the first person who needs to understand the value of it is the CEO himself or herself, and possibly the board as much. I'm not suggesting they can solve for it, but if they don't appreciate the value of this, highly unlikely this change is happening. I'm going to actually quote the words of Warren Buffett, who said this after the 2008 crisis. I guess he did it in his own style. He said, the CEO is the CRO, ... Only the CEO can really get the whole picture. You can't delegate risk to this risk manager or whoever you call him and leave it there. It has to come to the CEO's desk. This is 2009, we're in 2022. So, and we really saw this play out real life as we did our industry consultation. The second myth, the chief risk officer or whatever else name you want to give, cannot afford to be an N-2. The whole point that I made about a chief risk officer rolling up to the CFO, fundamentally, again, as flawed as it can be. Because you're effectively accepting that that individual does not need to be at the table where critical decisions happen, because for that you need to be at that CXO level. So you use the word CRO, but you conveniently position, and it's not about CFO, even if you rolled up to some other CXO, the fact is it's N-2. As an org design that's flawed, how do you draw empowerment? Like if I may borrow Mr. Damodaran's comment when I had met him, he said, there are 4 ministries in the country that you can't kind of give out to the private sector. It's defense, finance, home, and external, right? You could try and privatize many other things, but not these 4. Similarly, here's a role that you can't delegate down and say you're a CFO -1 or whoever -1. So that's the second myth. If the code's to be successful, that's the second myth to be broken. The third myth, actually related to that, is the fact that the point that I made about the CFO who I met said, things that have to go wrong will go wrong. The reality is that it comes out of a view that being prepared for business as usual is good enough. The reality is that the big risks that have actually gone and brought down organizations, they are not the business as usual risks. It's not about a purchase order being approved by 1 level below. That's really not going to bring down a company. But they are often the known unknowns, unknown unknowns. They are non-business as usual. How many companies actually have the skill set, forget even headset, do they even have the skill set in the decision makers and the process designers to do effective scenario analysis as to what if? If everything worked fine, you're protected, but if it only breaks down when it doesn't work. So our companies prepared for the BAU. So that's the third myth. The fourth myth, risk function questions decisions and slows down decision making. And I think the repeated analogy I always use is about brakes in the car. Some of you, hopefully if you like driving fast, like I do, you can drive that fast because you've got to know that there's a brake that can slow it down if you need to. A good and well-governed risk management framework actually is exactly the same. It's meant to allow businesses to take faster, bolder, risk-informed decisions, knowing very well that if things went south or off track, there's a governance framework which is going to quickly pick it up, give you the signals to do the course correction. But the fact is that it does not slow down. It's actually meant to enable, as I said, faster, bolder, risk-informed decision making. The fifth myth, and we heard it quite a few times again through the consultation process. Having a CRO abdicates rest of the leaders in the organization from the task of risk management. And interestingly, this is exactly what I got as a question from a finance leader in Chicago about a year back. Then why do we have a CRO? It completely makes it sound like that individual's problem. And my response to this finance leader, actually the CFO, was, how many decisions do you take in the company? And for the rest of them, you assume that your business leaders take all decisions to financially hurt the company? Obviously no. But you still do have a CFO because you need someone who has the ability to take those specific decisions. You have specific capabilities. Why would you assume that things which sometimes do get technical, and I deliberately want to make it sound technical, which is impact, consequence, velocity, 4 T's of risk management, inherent risk, residual risk, I don't see a reason as to why every procurement officer, or procurement leader, or operations leader needs to get all of those technicalities. Leave it for the risk function to own that technicality. But at the same time, there is no reason for business leaders to be abdicated of the responsibility of risk management. So that's the fifth. The sixth one, I think it got picked up a little while back. It's only meant for large companies. Why do startups need it? Why do MSMEs need it? Maybe the answer is obvious and just about not that obvious, which is, are startups any less exposed to risks? Do startups fail less than large companies? Is it not relevant for promoter-led companies? Would we like to believe promoters would not like to add to their wealth creation in an honest manner? Do we believe that MSMEs have a waiver to risk? If risk management is indeed appreciated as value creation and prevention of value erosion or value preservation, whatever you want to call it, then it's got to be as applicable for everyone. So honestly, those were if anyone asks me what's the intent of the code, those are the 6 myths that we hope the code kind of establishes over a period of time as what it is not. We've started the journey. This is not where this ends. We do hope to continue this association with FICCI to convert this into a risk center of excellence. We do hope to continue to publish some guidance notes because obviously we want to keep the code up to a certain length. It's still become lengthy, but we didn't want to make this any more voluminous. But we have heard through the consultation phase ask for a little bit more of how do we do this. And I guess that's more important for companies who don't have a very well matured function. We also have some areas on which we did believe that there was an opportunity to double click. So we will do those guidance notes, which you should see coming out in the next 12 to 18 months. And obviously, as much as we don't want this to become a source of consulting revenue, and therefore the intent's not to drive it through regulation, but yes, we definitely would love to see how could we possibly take this to the MCA or to other relevant regulatory bodies to drive a little bit more adoption. One of the things that I did want to call out as well is as we've gone through the code, there have been certain views which are about how universal is this. And I think the only submission I have for all readers of this is that it does require an element of adaptation. It can't be that exactly the same stuff's going to work for everyone, but I think it's a start, it's a framework, and hopefully, if implemented, it manages to take away these 6 myths as I called it out. Super excited of what this could be, and obviously before I sign off, while we will have a formal vote of thanks at the end, I do want to take this opportunity to thank a specific set of people. FICCI, firstly, for your terrific partnership. For everything you've done to allow us to get the necessary industry consultation going from your end. A very, very sincere word of thanks and gratitude to every single member of the Risk Task Force, just for being as engaged as you were. I think it was worrying to start with when you started with 18 task force members as to was this going to become just one of those task forces where 4 people have a view and the rest are there on the task force. It was absolutely gratifying to see that no, indeed, the entire task force was engaged. We got views for almost every single of the 18. So thank you so much to every single Risk Task Force member, to the working committee of the Risk Task Force, which put in truckloads of effort. And needless to say, all my colleagues back at GRMI. I think the lot went into this indeed. It was possibly not 25/8, but it still was indeed a truckload of effort. So thank you so much to everyone at GRMI for putting this together. Thank you so much. Giving it away, I think the first one is someone who has his own introduction of who he is. But to me, he is the cricket player and on the grounds from my Anderson days. Obviously, he sort of is synonymous with BMR Legal Advisors. I'm actually read this up because I just don't know Mukesh the way it is on the paper. I know Mukesh very different. So this I'm going to need a paper, unfortunately. So he's the founder and managing partner of BMR Legal. He advises Fortune 500 companies. He's done cross-border tax treaty transfer pricing matter in foreign jurisdictions. And I can go on, it's a page. But please welcome on stage Mukesh. The second similar-ish introduction in terms of, I can read stuff from here, but I was saying it before the start of the event. So I'm an eco grad, and when I started my career in Anderson, the first mandate I got was SGS Thompson Books of Accounts. All of accounting that I knew was 2 weeks of local basic accounting course that Anderson had to start off one's career. So you can imagine how little I knew, and imagine the risk SGS Thompson had me maintaining their books of accounts. So my post-lunch accounting advisor, we started the career at the same time, so I know her college because obviously it's SRCC. And then someone who's obviously gone and done a lot of stuff for which I need this again. So she leads Spencer Stuart's operations in India. She advises clients on board and CEO succession, over 25 years of experience, been with JP Morgan's institutional equity sales desk in Mumbai before, stint with Bear Stearns as in the firm's equity research business as a senior economist, qualified C, as I said, and MBA from Columbia Business School. Please welcome on stage Ritu. And the third panelist, again, I'll get to his paper introduction in a bit, but someone who proved how small the world is. I was there in Mumbai at one of the leading business schools, trying to figure out whether GRMI could build an association with that business school or not. And obviously, this individual was extremely sort of helpful through the process. Just as I entered, he said, "I already know you." And I was like, and I honestly had been introduced to him by Mr. Bhargava. I had no clue how he know me. And he said, "You hired my son in 2005, and we set up Access in 2004. And then I tried to say, I was trying to be impressive, saying, we've got senior academia associated with us. So I said, by the way, our academic council chair and the president is Professor Madhu Vij of FMS. So he says, yeah, Madhu, I know. Madhu's father was my PhD guide. And I remember, sort of in the rains, they were all stuck. We sort of got them out of their house in a boat. And I remembered Professor Vij's daughter, Anu, who also happens to be here today in the room. So that's how small the world is. But obviously, the more formal introduction, co-founder of the Open Ed Works, former Vice Chancellor, SVKM's Narsi Munji, former director of IIM Indore and SP Jain, author of 2 books in marketing and over 70+ articles, member of the Board of Governors of Management and Entrepreneurship and Professional Skills Council in India, Chairman India Case Research Center Advisor FICCI, winner of multiple awards. Please welcome on stage Professor Rajan Saxena. So given that we figured out that there is this little microphone, so I'm going to go sit there, because that way you all can continue to address the group, because if I go there, you'll start turning your heads. So this way you all can continue to face the audience and just look at me only for the question. And if I may one more time request you all to sort of stay a little close to the microphone, because I think we struggled with a little bit of the video volume for the first session. And none of you need to go too fast. We are doing well on time. Rarely happens, but we are. Okay, so I'm going to start this off with you. As you see this from your lens as a board member, have you seen companies benefit from effective risk management?
The answer is certainly yes, but let me try and explain to you the reason why. I started working with boards in my independent capacity about 10 years back. And immediately thereafter, the 2013 code came. I'm glad that Mr. Damodaran mentioned that this was a big amiss in the 2013 code. But I realized that, and having practiced as a chartered accountant for a significant part of my work career, you get invited to either be a member of the audit committee or chair the audit committee. And my experience suggested that the risk committee was either subsidiary or largely non-existent. So if you look at the trend of time that boards spend on risk committee, it is relatively less than the time it spends on audit committee. That's not trying to say that you spend more time in audit committee and less on risk committee, but you certainly spend less time on risk committee. I also found that the chair of the audit committee was also the chair of the risk committee. And personally, I feel there is an inherent conflict of interest over there. Now that there is greater realization amongst the regulators and the fact that the future of the regulation looks like the chair of the risk committee ought to be an independent board member, ought to have its own independent identity, is good. Having said that, on a more optimistic note, it's not like trying to say that companies in general have played it the way I described it. There are many large number of companies that have really played the role of the risk management, and you can see it, whether that's evident from the quality of board, from the point of view of the debate that happens in a board, or for that matter, it reflects on the brand value of the company. So there is a resounding yes to your answer, but I just thought I'll just support it why I said yes.
Thank you so much, Mukesh. Ritu, if I may come to you. As you engage on board mandates, are you starting to hear companies talk more about risk management, or is it still some distance to go?
I think risk management in that context has had its own evolution, whether as a function, whether as a seat on the table for senior management, and now the importance of on the board itself. And I think Mr. Damodaran, you mentioned this earlier as well, and Mukesh, you as well, right? So it was in 2013 a big miss when the Committees Act actually did not mandate it as a committee. And then in 2015, when it did, it is a board appointed committee in that context, right? And that's been 7 years. When we look at a lot of, when we evaluate boards' effectiveness in that context, or we look at, just charters of risk management committees, or for that matter, just, what is best practices for risk committees across various boards. Because even here, it is actually a board-appointed committee for the top 500 listed entities. When we look at actually companies, it's the startups, it's the, not the top 500, which probably are in bigger need of actually having a board-mandated risk management committee. So these are steps in the right direction, but a lot that actually still needs to be sort of, desired from an outcome perspective. And, when 18 months back, Subhashish actually mentioned that this task force was going to set up, I was actually very excited, having been involved in some of the board effectiveness exercises, as, this is really the need of the hour. At least it gives a very comprehensive framework for boards and the risk management committees to be thinking about consistency in practices. Because right now, when we look at, like I said, the charters and the best practices, so to say, it's a very wide spectrum in that context, depending on the sector, depending on who's the chair, depending on, the company. So just forming some of that consistency in itself, I think will give a big boost to this particular aspect.
Thank you so much, Ritu. Coming to you, Professor Saxena. From an academia perspective, do you feel there is the desired level of appreciation around need to incorporate risk management curriculum? You and I have spoken about this. Terrific to get your views.
So, Ashish, the need for a finance, or let's say the risk management in the management schools had always been felt. It has never been in doubt. But most of the time, this has been in the finance area. So we are primarily looking at it more from a financial risk point of view. And one of the finance professor would be, teaching that kind of a course. But if you are asking me whether truly speaking, the risk as we understand today is really being taught, is it really a kind of a priority in the MBA curriculums or in the university curriculums? I think we still have to go a long way. And there is one reason for that. I like to put that across. As education, as a sector from where I come, unlike the industry, we have all thrived in a very long pause of equilibrium. We are not so volatile. The whole sector is not so uncertain as what we see in the case of industry. But the last 2 years, the pandemic and the advent of automation technologies today has today made it abundantly clear in the business schools that unless and until we bring risk as a course which is to be taught by the multidisciplinary faculty, it will not really be able to help in terms of developing graduates who are needed for the industry today.
Thank you so much, Professor Saxena. Mukesh, coming to you, you've seen had your share of experience around how regulations can end up making things more of a tick in the box. There's Clause 49 that happened, Mr. Damodar himself was involved with it, and many more. How do you prevent the model risk code potentially becoming another tick in the box exercise over time?
So let me just first talk about regulations in our nation. Our regulations are predominantly crisis driven in general. So let's look at some of the significant regulations that we have seen in the area of finance. Companies Act 2013. I still remember having a conversation with the then Minister of State for Corporate Affairs, and I told him that the draft 2013 Companies Act has been drafted in a manner as if every second company is going to end up the Satyam way. This is just an illustration. And subsequently this government recognized it when they carried out host of changes. One important change is decriminalization of the offenses. You go and ask, why were these provisions inserted in the act in the first place? They were inserted only because the regulator felt that the best way to deal with a situation of this kind is to have law. And this kind of resonates with the point that Mr. Damodaran was making, that if you thrust any regulation, then people will just comply with it and it will be nothing but a tick the box exercise. The second example is also the mishaps that we saw in 2016, 2017, which could have been avoided. I think if risk management committee was empowered, we could have had a better management of those situations. But the subsequent changes that were driven predominantly by SEBI, whether it was in related party transactions, whether it was discussing compliance requirements for companies which are actually not listed, all of these tend to address the same point, that it is regulations that drive. And that's not the correct way to look at it. I think that majority of the companies that wanted to embrace best practices in risk management have done it, and they do not need regulation to do that. Now, what happens when a regulation comes? That's not trying to say that everybody who is meant to comply with the regulations, but then we go through what we call it as a exercise to test how the regulations work. An example is corporate social responsibility. The contributions that were made towards that, it was considered at one point in time that this is not mandatory. But today you go and ask various boards, they will say, well, we have audit being conducted by the regulator to ensure whether we are meeting with the corporate social responsibility or not. I don't think that if risk management as a very important management tool has to succeed, it should go in the way of regulations. And to that extent, this initiative is very welcome, because FICCI is not a regulator. FICCI is an influencer. FICCI is the voice of business. And this partnership between academia and the voice of business really is the way ahead. Whether the government adopts this or not, whether the MCA gives a close look at it or not is, in my view, secondary. I really won't bother if for MCA, this is like any other document. But it's important for business, academicians, students, practitioners to embrace this in its form and in its spirit.
Thank you so much again, Mukesh. Ritu, do you continue to see a certain degree of sort of disparity between how risk management is viewed in the financial services segment versus others? And with some of the more recent European crisis, COVID, is any of that changing in terms of better appreciation for risk in non-financial service sector?
Yes, absolutely. And like they say, never let a crisis, go wasted in that respect. And I think 2008, when I was at the epicenter of, the earthquake that sent tremors across financial services and then became much broader at that point of time. And I know, Mukesh, you and I'd met a few months prior to that in New York. Yeah.
When the Lehman crisis happened.
Yeah, and then later on, Lehman crisis, you were there. So I think the one positive outcome, if I may say so, of that was just the rigor and appreciation of risk management within financial services. And I think at that point of time, that's when financial services companies started realizing that they need to sort of get onto that journey. And we've seen a little bit now as well, where in India, earlier with banks, you do see a separate sort of, chief internal audit officer, a separate chief risk officer, separate sort of chief compliance officer. Otherwise, as you were mentioning, everything was just one person and just reporting to sort of either the head of legal or, the CFO, and at some sort of, go around in that respect. So I think given that, and now we've seen this more recently also go on from banks to non-banking financial services. So in some respects, yes, financial services is far, far ahead. We've had the second crisis, and that actually has led to the appreciation going beyond financial services to non-financial services. And we were talking about supply chain risk in particular. I think it just came to a halt for a lot of places. And now when we are seeing the entire aspect around sort of, what's happening in Europe right now, that led to a lot of appreciation also when it comes to political risk. I think it's always been there, but I think that has enhanced. You're seeing appreciation of, some of that happening in non-financial services. Has it completely percolated in terms of, whether we're thinking about structure, composition of board, in terms of agendas? Not completely, I would say. It's definitely enhanced the importance, and it's being, at least one big agenda item when you're talking in terms of sort of all the issues around the board. But I think it's a long way in terms of it being thought about in a very comprehensive manner to that extent. But that's where something like, the board sort of, the risk code right now would actually help think about these things, because, we've seen it takes some crisis for everybody to actually then start working on it. So it is a journey in that respect.
Terrific. Professor Saxena, coming to you. You said there's been an appreciation for need for risk management, and obviously more so the financial risk management part of it. So even with that, if there is appreciation, do you think there's enough faculty available to actually deliver broader risk management curriculum in these business schools?
Subhashish, let me be very candid. I think education sector per se is today struggling to get the faculty per se. And to talk about faculty in only one area is perhaps too much of a stuff that is there. But nonetheless, I think we still don't have the faculty who is engaged in research in risk area, who is able to teach, who is able to consult in research in this particular area. And so therefore, from that kind of a point of view, there's certainly a gap in the management education and in the university education. When we were discussing a partnership with the GRMI, one of the primary goals of that partnership that I was really negotiating with you was that we would be able to draw upon the expertise of the GRMI in terms of the faculty that GRMI would be able to bring in to teach some of the courses in risk management. But very interestingly, when the matter went up to the board or to the trust, they said that no, but we do have the finance graduates. We do have the finance faculty, no? So let our finance faculty do some more research in the area of risk management. So they called up some of the people from finance area and asked, and obviously one of them who was truly engaged in that area said that, well, he was doing that kind of a research, and another faculty who was in the area of equity research said that he was also into that area. But in terms of the intensity that one would expect, it wasn't there. And the consequence of which we just couldn't really go through. But my point of view is, education sector per se today has a tremendous shortage of the faculty per se. And if we are not able to solve that today, we are in for a major crisis in this country, because demographic, we keep talking about a demographic advantage and everything. To my mind, that's going to turn into a disaster if we are not able to solve this particular aspect.
Staying on talent, Mukesh, I'll come to you. We all believe that this is the CRO is a position, it should be a direct report of the CEO, has a right to sit on the decision-making table. Do you believe this profession is attracting enough talent or adequate talent to really get to that seat on the table position?
So, Subhashish, before I answer your question on talent, when you talk about profession, means is the context the professional qualification, or is the context the core competency? I come from an era where, and Richard will bear with me, where when we joined public accounting in the good old days when I used to practice as a chartered accountant, we had audit practice, and then audit became assurance, and it became assurance and risk. So I think the watershed moment, in my view, was the last bastion of the Big Four or the Big Five falling and becoming Big Four, which gave rise to the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. And we saw many of those getting mirrored in our Indian regulations by Clause 49, and Sir was also there at the helm of affairs in SEBI. So I think over the years, the entire profession of accounting, audit, risk, assurance, which was in my view a forte of chartered accountants, has gone through a change. And I do remember some of the technical courses in the Narsimhanji Institute, my alma mater, I graduated from Narsimhanji, has been focusing on MBA students being imparted that qualification. You go to ISB today, ISB has a module on risk management. So I think that the risk management as a profession is agnostic to which part of discipline you belong to. You can have a chartered accountant, you can have an MBA, you can have a specialized risk professional, the kind of initiative that your institute has embarked upon would qualify. I think the focus here should be the practice of risk management, as we used to call it the practice of accounting. So to that extent, the practice of risk management is not the practice of accounting, is not the practice of auditing. And hence, I would kind of say that this is an area where talent needs to be honed up, and I think there is tremendous opportunity for professionals coming from, no matter what their professional qualification is, to be able to hone skills in the area of risk management. And this, in my view, is going to emerge as a very important vertical, not just from a corporate standpoint, but even from the point of view of risk service providers, if I may use that term.
Sure. Ritu, coming to you, are you starting to see boards differentiate between internal audit and risk committee enough? And two, are you starting to see boards looking for risk domain expertise, whether it be within the board, risk committee aside? Are you starting to see some change in that space?
Yeah, and here again, I would, differentiate, like I said, between financial services and non-financial services, because within financial services, there's definitely a lot more appreciation of the importance of risk management across sort of, again, functions, senior management board. And part of it is it's mandated. It's the regulator itself is sort of mandating it in that respect, right? So it does bring a different element of just appreciation of this aspect. We're not seeing the same thing happening more broadly across non-financial services. And when it comes to risk professionals, again going back to sort of Mukesh's point, it has not been we haven't had dedicated risk professionals trained within this particular space any which ways to sort of start from, right? Because it used to be chartered accountants who all of us have done everything in that context, and now then some there's specialization where I think different people took different sort of specializations. So having risk professionals actually who then get to sort of chief risk officer. So the journey actually has to start first within the management and the function itself. And when you have enough of a cohort of actually having people in non-financial services who actually are, senior leadership team members in that respect, and they are the ones who actually, in terms of then getting onto becoming the chair of, risk committees and everything will happen. So I think that evolution has some time to go. There is appreciation, and there are few boards where it is actually being asked for. But would it be something where I would say is it 50%? Probably not. It's more like 5 to 10%. Where this particular appreciation, and I'm saying non-financial services, I'm keeping that out because there it's a whole different story.
Great. So as we sort of kind of try and wind this one up, Professor Saxena, to you, in the education sector, are you seeing some universities, institutes sort of demonstrate more innovation, agility, and sort of create a competitive advantage by managing the more recent risks better?
Subhashish, perhaps innovation is the need of the hour, even in education sector. There's no doubt about it. But the realization about risk in the education sector came up in the last 2.5 years, the pandemic, where suddenly one found that that even in India, where the demand was assured, the demand can be volatile. We already started seeing a lot of institutions closing down. We also realized that the geopolitical environment was really impacting our ability to place the students in the rest of the world. And suddenly then we were really looking at it from the point of view of how do we manage the risks. Today, the day when, and I will particularly refer it to whether this is the public sector institutions like the IIMs or the IITs, or the private sector institutions like NMIMS or any other institutions. Huge amount of money has been invested in campuses. And in many of these cases, the campuses are remaining underutilized. So how do you service the debt? That has become a big question. So the question that is really there before everybody is, did we really make a right decision? That's one part. The second part that has happened, and I would refer back to what we started off in education sector on the awareness of risk. I think to a very large extent, the industry is to be also, this industry also has to share the responsibility. Because at the time of the corporate recruitment, what is it that we find that who's coming over and for what purposes they are recruiting? Rarely do we find anybody recruiting for risk management or the risk. Even the big four who are there on some of the IIMs and some of the top business school campuses, they're not recruiting. The finance guys, even if they were recruiting for finance, they were not recruiting it for risk. So the students' demand for risk management courses is not there. And at the board level, therefore, the awareness from the point of view of the management of the institution and from the point of view of managing the fund flows, yes, there is today a need that has come up. More and more institutions understand that if they are not able to really sort of hedge their risks, they are in for a very major problem.
Thank you so much. Thank you, dear panelists. Thank you, Mukesh. Thank you, dear panelists. Thank you, Mukesh. Thank you, Ritu. Thank you, Professor Saxena, for a terrific session. I'm sure everyone had lots to take away from this. Thank you once again.
Have to start with many thank yous. First and foremost, Subhashish for doing this report. Very much needed, and I think for all companies, as Mr. Damodharan said, it's always been important, but as we see changes coming at us, which are unpredictable and coming at us fast and furious, I think having a very well thought through risk management system has become more and more imperative. When I look back at my career and I think of all the mistakes that were made, instances where one looked back and said we could have done better, the bottom line missing element was really having not looked at all the risk factors. And I think it was maybe Mukesh who said, or Ritu, that we tended to look at risks really from a financial point of view. That's in the DNA of a lot of corporate leaders, and that doesn't take into account many of the risks that one needs to look at. So from the perspective of a financier, typically we spend, I would say, 80% of our diligence on financial aspects, operational aspects, and I would say as an add-on, we would look at things like maybe the organization, technical skills, financial skills. Rarely would we interview board members. Rarely would we look at, the second and third layer of bench that was there for succession planning. And things like environment, social, governance aspect was for a long time a tick the box. I remember as a young investment professional in IFC, when the then CEO of IFC, and this is back in 1997, said that sustainability and ESG elements had to be part and parcel of the way in which we look at investments. All of us threw up our arms and said, we're already bureaucratic and not competitive, and this is like a huge millstone around our neck. And he turned around and told us, a few years from now, you're going to thank me because this millstone is really going to be your ticket for the future. And he was 100% right. Today, I cannot imagine how any company can run its business without taking into account environmental aspects. And as we see extreme weather conditions, again, unpredictability. One of the CEOs of the largest global insurance company has said that if we cannot keep it within the 1.5 degrees targeted in terms of global temperature, most of these extreme weather events will become uninsurable. And then who do we turn to? Because insurance has always been sort of taken as the way in which we address risks. And if the large insurance companies are turning around and telling us that these extreme weather events are not going to be insurable, then we have a huge gaping risk staring at us, which there is no remedy for. Another aspect that, we thought, okay, we've been through the Cold War, we've been through the breakup of the erstwhile Soviet Union, we've been through several smaller wars, but things that we didn't really anticipate of what's happening today on the geopolitical front is again a huge risk which is really difficult to predict. Just as we were talking about whether there could be really a war type situation between the US and China, given where Trump was headed, that seemed to sort of settle for a short while after he left. But then we have Russia and Ukraine and all of Europe and the entire energy equation, global energy equation thrown into a tizzy, and that's causing us to rethink a lot of decision making. So the one thing that I'd say, Mr. Damodran, that you mentioned that risk was always there, what I see is that the pace, the unpredictability, the volatility, and the multifarious types of risks that are coming at us are really making us much more aware that we need to have someone in the organization who's firefighting not just on a day-to-day basis, but more strategically, and being able to think before these events hit us. Another risk factor that often gets sort of not taken into account, and here I look at Raghuram Rajan, who wrote about the third pillar, and he says how, the state and businesses have come together and there's more of a collaborative working between the two. The government even asks our opinion on regulations. There's public consultation. So one would say that, between the state and business, there is a dialogue and there is an opportunity for each side to express their logic. The element that has totally yet not been addressed is community. And this is the third pillar that Raghu refers to in his book. Post the pandemic, that has, I think, become even more acute. And this is one of those risks which all of us think of as somebody else's problem. It's societal inequity, it's the fact that people are getting more nationalistic and more xenophobic. These are things which is difficult to translate, understand, interpret from a corporate perspective. But in my view, it's one of the huge risks that is there underlying, and the pandemic has only underscored that. So again, that brings me to my final point, which is, in my view, there's that aspect of risk as you've codified in this model risk code. There are checks and balances, processes. I remember at CDPQ, which is Canada's second largest pension fund, in 2017, we decided that we're going to go public with our commitments on reducing carbon emissions and generating more green investments. And it was nice. Everybody felt good about it. We announced and we said, in fact, and just let's keep this within the room, we did try in the beginning to get all the Maple 8, the large pension funds in Canada, to do this collectively. But there was a sense that, do we really have to? Especially given that a lot of us had large oil and gas investments. So this would kind of shine the light on how are we building our portfolios for our pensioners, right? So we said, okay, let's do this ourselves, and we'll depend on stewardship and setting a good example to get the others follow. What then happened was that we had these targets, but we really saw the change when the performance on those targets was linked to the bonuses that we were paid. And what that did was that even the junior most analyst in our team started questioning why were we doing certain investments which was going to get us to breach those targets. And you had that bottom-up alignment, and therefore I think in terms of addressing risks and really bringing about systemic change, having that link to incentives is very, very critical. And, all of you mentioned disruptions from technology, the fact that digitization has become so important. The counter aspect, I would say, is the whole issue of cyber security. And I can tell you that we in India are sitting naked on many, many fronts. Again, not to be quoted outside, but if you look at the transmission network, it's one of the easiest things to bring down with a cyber attack. And do we have the kind of cyber risk mitigation that is needed for these kind of huge infrastructure assets that today really have not been addressed? So that's another aspect, while we celebrate the India stack and the increase in digitization, I think we need to have an equally forceful cybersecurity risk mitigation approach. And linked to that is also data privacy. So this is something where, different countries have adopted different approaches. In India, we're still thinking about how we should approach it. And I think India could really be a leader in this area of addressing data privacy while giving access and becoming more digitized and taking advantage of the India stack. And the last point I would make is that with all the kind of risks that are there, one of the biggest elements that companies, big and small, startup, very well established, need is leadership. And often it's when there's absence of leadership that we find that risks overtake us. So I would say that all of us need, along with the model risk code, vaccination for braver leadership in terms of the bolder and risk intelligent decision making.
So Richard, starting with the fact that EWRM has really existed from the time great Mr. Deloach wrote the EWRM book right before Anderson folded up. It's about 20 years. What's preventing companies from really appreciating the value of risk management?
Subhashish, while a lot of people have spoken here about enterprise risk management, people not doing it, I have a slightly different view to it. I think when corporate governance or Clause 49 came into India, it was rock bottom. I mean, there was nothing. And we just thought at that point of time, can these Indian companies ever come up to that level of corporate governance? Okay, there are still issues, but I think we've come a long way. And in that, I think a lot of companies did adopt good risk management processes, my view. They adopted good risk management processes at that time. But what happened is the companies which did it to tick the box and the companies who did it in spirit were the differentiators. So the ones who actually took it in spirit are the ones who actually went and developed it well. And I think that's where, the point we have been discussing along most at least when I started my career in risk management, I thought it was business risks. And it was simple because you identified from the books, financial risk, you understood. But at that point of time, we really didn't understand what is the big elephant in the room. The big elephant in the room is all the risks which are outside your environment, outside your company. It was a socio-political risk, the risk from environment, the risk from the stakeholders, the other kind of risks which were actually impacting. And companies were getting technology. In fact, today, if you look at it, today I could have a very successful company with a good business model doing very well, and then a new company comes in and completely disrupts that model. It's gone, it's over. And one can see that happen in so many cases. So I think the question of risk management has completely changed. It is about business, and the front line has to be led by business. It has to be led by the CEO. Any initiative of this kind, if it has not got the stamp of the CEO, and if he's not going to drive it, I don't think it's going to go anywhere. It cannot be delegated down to the lowest bottom. So I would say, so CEOs face many challenges, and I think risk is their biggest challenge. And if they understand it, I think it'll be successful. And I can tell you in this post-COVID, and Mr. Damodaran, you have sat on so many boards, in post-COVID, the companies that actually bounced back faster are the ones which had better risk management. And the people who knew how to conserve cash, the people who had cash on their balance sheet, who used it, because opportunities were also there. COVID was not a dead thing, it was an opportunity, and I've seen so many companies actually take advantage of it and have done very well. So Subhashish, I think when we talk of risk, we look at the negative aspect. On the other side of risk is reward. And I think that's what we need to see. How do we actually capture that value out there and take it forward?
Thank you, Richard. So, Richard, if you go back again to our Anderson days, we are CAs. I personally was in the external audit practice, and then someday Sanjay Mehta said, I'm going to start BPRC, Business Process Risk Consulting. We became BPRC. If you remember, Ram was then there. He now is a big EY leader globally. We then renamed it to Contract Audit Services. We found ways to make it sound different. Then we said BPRC plus TRC, which is Technology Risk Consulting, became Risk Advisory. But fundamentally, we're the same set of people. And which is why I say the biggest risk in the world possibly is the fact that risk professionals are the most untrained risk professionals themselves. How do you see this changing, both in the corporate world, who don't even have the luxury of what the big fours have, and in the advisory world?
So I think everybody's misunderstood enterprise risk management. And I think you hit the nail on the head, and it's a very good question. Because I'm also guilty. When we put up risk management, what we did, we took these resprayed auditors and made them into risk consultants. And if you really want good risk consultants, they have a very different mindset. They've got to be engineers, they've got to be MBAs, they've got to be economists. You need those kind of people who have a deep understanding of business, because only they can make, because all the risks happen in the business. They don't happen at the back end. And I don't think chartered accountants per se are qualified to be risk managers. This is my view, and I'm just putting it down there. And I remember this one thing came to light when we got a very big enterprise risk management exam, and we put our normal team out there, and the guy said, no, this team can't work. We need your consultants, the real consultants, not the resprayed auditors. So I think what happened in the Big Four was post-Anderson, when they were building out their consulting practices, most people who were auditors became consultants, and over a period of time, they became experts. You do 2 engagements and you're an expert. You do 3 engagements and you're this thing of it. But I think those are some misnomers that have happened. And I think we have to go back to the basics, and we need to understand that the internal auditor will be the person who will be a chartered accountant, cost accountant, or whatever. But the risk management professional has to be somebody from the business who understands business and who can go deep into it. And that kind of person can truly bring value to it. Because just imagine talking to a business leader and telling him, this is wrong. What will you be able to tell him as a chartered accountant? But if you are somebody who's been there, will be able to have a very useful discussion and be able to add value. Because ultimately, in my view, it's about adding value to the process. And if you're able to add value to the process, I think that's when we will see the difference coming in risk management. So I think you also need some different kind of skills, complex problem solving skills. You need to be innovative in your thinking. You need to have creative thinking. So it's not about qualification today. I think we have to move away from these qualifications. It's about how students are being brought up. And I think Professor Rajan, while you did not speak about it, but I think even universities and colleges and all need to change the thinking of students of how they solve problems, because that is what is going to differentiate. Because nobody is asking, are you a chartered accountant? Are you a finance HR professional? They are asking, do you have these skills today in today's world to actually do well? And I think that's where it will come in.
So just building on what you have said in terms of student sort of universities, do you think students today have, like, you started the
So you started this whole campus stuff at KPMG as well with the risk practice. Do you think there's enough appreciation in the student community, awareness, I wouldn't say appreciation, awareness in the student community of what a career in risk management can actually evolve to be for it to attract talent at that grassroots level of the quality that you need to have all those skills that you're talking about, problem solving, analytical thinking? Do you think there's enough awareness around that for it to be happening well?
I think it's not so much amongst the students. I think it has to be amongst the corporates who are going to do the hiring. I think the corporates need to understand, do they want risk professionals, true risk professionals to sit there and look at it. And once they understand they require it, I think we would see the change. Students, why will student do a course? He does a course because he or she can get a job after that. And if he does, suppose he does a course with your institute, and after 1 year there is no job, people will stop coming, because they pay so much fees for a course, and then it doesn't actually convert into anything. So my suggestion, Subhashish, is I think there needs to be much more awareness among the corporates. And like in the, like I remember when IFRS first came, everybody didn't understand the enormity of IFRS. So what they did was they did board trainings, they did senior management trainings, awareness sessions. Who trained the army of accountants who had to now look at accounting very differently? And that's where all the issues all started. So there'll have to be army of people who also will need to be trained. So the students which you are doing is fantastic because you are training them at ground level. But I think we need to take this to different levels. We need to take it to mid-level, senior management level, board level, because this, according to me, today, lifelong learning it is. So once you get out of college at 24 or MBA or whatever, you have to keep coming back at different parts of your career. So even if you are 60 years old, you will still come back to do a course and do something different. So I think it is time that we bring this enterprise risk management, we make it attractive. See, because is it attractive enough for students to do it? Will they get a job which will pay for the, will make it there? Some people understand it. The fact that you have taken out 200 professionals, Mr. Bhargav, you said 200 professionals have come out. So obviously they're working somewhere, and obviously they're doing well. And but we need to spread it much more. 200 is not good enough for a country of India's size. Maybe in Delhi also it's not enough. So, I'm not blaming you, but I think it needs to get into the university. And Professor Saxena has already said there is no appreciation of it. Because education is making its good money, it doesn't need to be shaken up too much. I think these new courses have to come in. Risk management can be one course that actually universities can take up for that, from that purpose. But I think you need to make it, so I mean, why don't you and FICCI and others actually make it an attractive proposition when we go to corporates and tell them, boss, you need these kind of risk professions in your team. And they will start hiring people at good salaries. Because you can't pay a risk professional the salary of, sorry if I'm going to say something now, of an internal auditor. Because they are a differentiated lot. And I think we need to pay it. Because I'll tell you, in our business, when I was running in the Big Four, I realized that if you wanted to attract good talent in some places, you didn't have to bother about your salary bands. You'd never get them. And you cannot democratize everything else, because then you're a loss-making company. So I think we must make risk professionals so attractive that people get well compensated, they study hard, they are well qualified to actually do it. I think we should start attracting engineering students into this, because their mindset thinking is very different. I think they can make very good risk professionals. This is my view.
Thank you so much, Richard. I can't sort of not respond to some of it before going back to a question to you. One, we do have lots of engineers come to the institute. Two, the Big Fours are the primary employers today. We are giving the business schools a run for their money in terms of what the initial compensation is, but it's still not, it's still the internal auditor salary. So that was just my response to your comment. I was feeling very good because these guys came and gave this to me. I thought, I've done consulting, now gone into academia. I thought I was a chance to move to the media world. Now this says business world, but unfortunately this is not working, so I'm going to come back to this. Uh, you heard me talk about one of the myths, Richard, which is the CEO still forwards risk management stuff to the head of audit. How do you change that? How do you drive home the fact that this is a first and second line of defense? This is at the heart of business, as you yourself called out. How do you drive that change?
Okay, I'll just tell you, I'll just give in a different context. I'm sorry, nothing to do with risk here. When I left KPMG, while I was at KPMG, I was proud of one thing which I did was I launched the higher purpose in KPMG. And it was one of the most successful launches within the KPMG world in India. It got reported by Harvard. They did a case study on it. And it was a very successful launch. Why? Because the CEO personally took it as his agenda. First, I gave it to HR, honestly. Nothing happened. So I'm not saying HR is bad, but I gave it to them. Nothing happened. So I said, no, this is my cup of tea. I've got to run it myself. And I did it. And so when I left KPMG, about a little after a year, KPMG India, a little after a year, a very big technology IT company in India, maybe one of the biggest in the country, called me and asked me that, would you do this higher purpose for us? Would you come and put it for us the way you did it at KPMG? I said, who's driving this initiative? Does the CEO drive this initiative? They said, no. I said, then I'm the wrong person. Because if this is not driven from the CEO, this will be a flop. This will be one more tick in the box and nothing is going to happen. And with all honesty, Subhashish, whenever I meet people from KPMG, the one thing, ex-KPMG now, when I meet, some of them are also ex, they say we can never forget that higher purpose. So I think it is something which sticks with people, the way you put it across, that it never leaves you. But I think the CEOs which actually give it away to internal audit or give it away to somebody else are abdicating their responsibilities. Because nobody's thought of risk management being serious. But if you have not thought of risk management being serious, then there's a wake-up call already there for many of the companies. And I think those cases need to be put out because you will put all the good cases, you never put the failures. Once we put the failures out there and tell them, if you have a good risk management process, yeah, it's expensive. It's not cheap. But just imagine not having it and what is the expense you incur in terms of penalties and liabilities and losses and everything else that you face. And I think that is something that needs to be put to them. CEO has to drive a robust risk management process themselves. It has to be driven at the ExCom. Secondly, I think one thing that is missing in this entire, I don't know whether you will agree, is that we don't take risk management as part of main strategy. It's one add-on, bolt-on somewhere, and then it comes. If it's bolt-on, it'll remain bolt-on. If it is not mainstream, it is not mainstream. I think it has to be part of the main strategy of the company. When you do your financial reviews every week, every month, or whenever you do it, risk management has to be reviewed with the same amount of rigor and has to be part of that whole process. It needs to have a board position, so you need to have a senior enough person who actually understands it and gives it. Secondly, every single individual out there needs to understand he's the risk management professional, because every time he goes out, he or she goes out there, they are creating a risk for the company. And if they understand that, I think we would have come over it, but it has to be driven at the top level. It has to get into, we heard Anita George talk about affirmative action. I think affirmative action is very good. I've seen it work in so many places. Affirmative action actually works, and I think that's what corporates need to do. It needs to be outcome-based. It needs to be put part of your performance goals, and you need to get evaluated, compensated, or whichever way, you know, if you're not done well, then you're not done well, and you will have to suffer for it.
Thank you, Richard. And since you made the comment, one of the things that came through during the consultation phase actually is exactly the problem that you called out, which is for one of the reasonably, I would say, extremely aspirational brands in the country, the feedback we got was, can the RMC really get into areas like M&A and strategy? And I was like, if that's what is coming from an aspirational brand, those are possibly the two greatest risk areas we certainly have a problem to solve for. So as we wind this one up, the last one for you, which is, and you have touched upon this, but how do you see companies appreciating value creation, prevention of value erosion, value preservation, what do you want to call it? How does one amplify this? Because I don't think this room obviously gets it, but how do you amplify it for this to get where it deserves to?
See, whenever you start any new initiative, whether it is women on boards or corporate governance, everybody in the audience comes and asks me, show me empirical evidence. Don't talk all this rubbish because it's not going to help. And we have seen it. The companies which have more women on boards, 3 and more women on boards, have been financially more successful than the other companies. The question which I put to one audience was, suppose it was not Lehman Brothers, but Lehman Sisters, would it have survived? So, so the point is, I think the way we should look at it is, we need to get the people engaged into understanding what risk management is there. The CEOs and the boards need to become more importance of managing risk. Secondly, I think like corporate governance, overall corporate governance did, they improve the valuation. People want to see what will we get out of it at the end. Will we be better valued? There'll be no discounting when a private equity comes to invest in us, or when somebody wants to buy us. If these kind of things can be proved through a good risk management process, I think that is the final outcome of it. But I think in the interim phase, it is how did even managing a loss is a gain. I mean, suppose a big risk event happened and you didn't get impacted, your company didn't get impacted. Isn't that a benefit to others who got actually impacted? So how do we actually amplify this? And it's about amplification, about awareness. And I think, Subhashish, we need to take it down to the mediums. I think, Mr. Damodharan, you said about it, the backbone of our economy is the small and medium sector. I think we need to take it to the startup community. All the failures which we have seen in the startups after they grew was because of wrong M&A. And then you said you don't need risk management in M&A. I mean, it's a joke. So I think one needs to look at every action of a company, new product launch, huge discounting in the market, everything needs to have a good. So your risk management is a line 1 and line 2 for all technical people out here. Line 2 of defense or internal audit is line 3. So I think the line 1 and line 2 are both the senior management and middle-level management who put the processes and policies in place. And those need to be actually, so when you make a decision in the market that I'm going to give a discount, you will then do it on a proper evaluation. Okay, by giving this discount, this is the maximum loss I will have, or this is the profit erosion I'll have. But on the other hand, I would have gained market share and I would have become a market leader or whatever. Because do we gain market share? I remember one of the top companies in India where the chairman came to the company and said, so how much are you growing? So they said, oh, we are growing 20%. So he said, how much market share have you gained? They had no answer. So the point is, it is market share gain and just not your growth, which is important, because everybody is growing, you're also growing, so what's so great about it? So I think risk management, when we can prove, and Subhashish, this is one work which you could carry out further with the team and everybody, is how do you do value creation, value preservation, which you spoke about those 2 words, and we've heard it during the evening also. I think value creation, value preservation, and the reward which sits at the end of risk, if we can amplify all of this, I think we would have succeeded.
Thank you so much, Richard. That was so you, direct, candid, no holding back. Thank you so much for your time. So we get to that part of the evening, which firstly, I was not prepared for. It was not planned for me, so bear with me. 2, I know this is all that keeps you away from snacks and cocktails, but I guess is an imperative part, which is thanking everyone who's made this possible. So obviously, I'll start with the chairman of the Risk Task Force, Mr. Damodharan. Thank you so much, sir, for firstly agreeing to chair this, for every bit of guidance that we had from you through the journey. Thank you so much, sir.